Welcome to Experiments in Happiness with Michelle Lemus, the podcast for high-achieving women who've checked all the boxes but still feel something's missing.
I think one of the hardest parts of personal growth is that nobody really prepares you for the middle. People talk about the beginning, the breakthrough moment, the realization, the inspiration, the excitement of deciding you want something different. And people love talking about the end result, the healed version, the confident version, the aligned version, the woman who finally figured it out. But almost nobody talks about the in between, that strange middle space where who you used to be no longer fully fits, but who you're becoming doesn't feel fully solid yet either. And honestly, I think that's where a lot of women quietly panic. Because growth sounds beautiful in theory, but in reality, growth often feels uncomfortable before it feels empowering. It feels uncertain, messy, lonely sometimes. And I think a lot of women mistake that discomfort for failure. Like, why am I suddenly so emotional? Why does this feel harder now? Why can't I just go back to how I used to be? Why does everything feel so weird lately? And honestly, I think part of the reason this phase feels so disorienting is because your old ways of operating used to work. That's important. You didn't become the version of yourself you've been for no reason. There were reasons. You learned how to be dependable, accommodating, responsible, easy to rely on. You learned how to keep things running smoothly, how to avoid conflict, how to manage people, how to handle pressure. And honestly, those traits probably helped you build a pretty functional life. They helped you succeed. They helped you survive certain seasons. They helped you create relationships and stability and achievement, which is why growth can feel so confusing sometimes. Because the things you're outgrowing aren't necessarily bad. That's what makes it complicated. You're not always outgrowing chaos. Sometimes you're outgrowing patterns that once protected you, patterns that once helped you feel safe, accepted, valuable. And I think that's why personal growth often creates so much internal friction, because part of you knows this way of operating no longer feels aligned, but another part of you is terrified to let it go because it's familiar, and familiar feels safe even when it no longer feels good. I think a lot of women experience this when they first start setting boundaries. At first, it feels empowering for about 5 seconds, and then immediately after that comes guilt, panic, over explaining, second guessing, wanting to take it back. And then they think, maybe I'm not actually growing, maybe I'm just becoming difficult. But honestly, I think that discomfort is often evidence that growth is actually happening. Because if you've spent years prioritizing other people over yourself, choosing yourself will initially feel uncomfortable, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things almost always feel unstable at first. I think this is one of the biggest things women misunderstand about growth. They assume growth should feel natural immediately, aligned immediately, confident immediately. But honestly, most growth feels awkward before it feels embodied. It's like trying on a new version of yourself that doesn't fully feel like yours yet. You're practicing new behaviors while your nervous system is still wired for the old ones. So you go back and forth. One day you feel strong and grounded. The next day you feel guilty for having needs. One moment you say no confidently. The next moment you write a 3-paragraph explanation apologizing for it. One day you feel clear about what you want. The next day you question everything again. And honestly, I think a lot of women think this inconsistency means they're failing, but I actually think it's part of the process because identity shifts slowly. That's important. You don't wake up one day magically transformed into a completely different person. Identity changes through repetition, tiny moments, tiny choices, tiny behaviors practiced over and over again. And I think that's why the middle feels so emotionally exhausting sometimes, because you're emotionally untangling from an identity that's been familiar for years, maybe decades. And honestly, there's grief in that sometimes, even when growth is healthy. But because your old identity probably brought you approval, belonging, validation, predictability, people knew you as the reliable one, the calm one, the easygoing one, the one who could always handle things. And when you start changing, people notice, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly. And honestly, sometimes the people around you become uncomfortable when you stop playing the role they're used to. That's difficult, especially for women who built their identity around being liked, around being helpful, around being emotionally easy for everybody else. Because growth often requires disappointing the version of you that learned. My value comes from what I provide. That's hard. And I think a lot of women unconsciously believe if I stop being who I've always been, people won't love me the same. Or who even am I if I'm not constantly helping, managing, fixing, achieving? And honestly, that identity uncertainty can feel terrifying because even if your old identity exhausted you, at least you understood it. At least you knew how to succeed inside it. The new version of you, she's less familiar. And I think this is where many women try to rush the process. They want clarity immediately. They want certainty immediately. They want to fully become the new version overnight. But honestly, I don't think growth works that way. I think there's a season where you exist between identities and it feels uncomfortable because your external behaviors are changing before your internal self trust fully catches up. That's normal. I think about this a lot with boundaries because boundaries are easy conceptually, but emotionally, they can feel brutal at first, especially if you're used to being needed, especially if you're used to proving your worth through availability. Because the moment you stop automatically overgiving, you often feel selfish before you feel healthy. That's the in between. And I think women need to hear that more often. Just because something feels uncomfortable does not mean it's wrong. Sometimes discomfort is simply the space between your old identity and your new one. And honestly, I think one of the most important parts of growth is learning not to run backward every time discomfort shows up, because your brain will try. It'll try to pull you back toward familiar patterns constantly. Go back to over explaining. Go back to people pleasing. Go back to over functioning. Go back to shrinking yourself because your nervous system associates familiar with safe, even if familiar was exhausting. And I think this is especially hard for high achieving women because they're used to competence, used to certainty, used to being good at things. But growth puts you into emotional beginner mode. You're practicing new responses, new boundaries, new ways of existing. Of course, it feels awkward. You're learning. And honestly, I think a lot of women abandon growth too early because they expect themselves to feel fully confident before continuing. But confidence usually comes after repetition, not before it. You build self trust by practicing alignment repeatedly, not by thinking about it endlessly. And I think this is where women get stuck sometimes. They intellectualize growth instead of practicing it. They wait to feel fully ready before acting differently. But identity shifts through action. Every time you respond differently, you reinforce a new version of yourself. Every time you choose alignment over autopilot, you strengthen that identity. Even if it feels awkward, even if your voice shakes, even if part of you still feels guilty, that still counts, honestly. I think growth is often much less glamorous than people expect. It's not usually giant movie moments. It's tiny moments where you pause before defaulting to old patterns. Tiny moments where you say, actually, I don't want to do this anymore. Tiny moments where you stop abandoning yourself automatically. And over time, those tiny moments change you. I also think one of the hardest parts of outgrowing your old self is realizing some relationships were built around the old version of you. That can be painful because when you change, relationship dynamics change too. Sometimes people adapt beautifully, sometimes they don't. Sometimes people benefited from the version of you that had no boundaries, no needs, no limits. And when you start changing, they experience that change as loss, even if the change is healthy for you. That's difficult emotionally, especially if you're compassionate, especially if you hate disappointing people. But honestly, you cannot keep abandoning yourself just to maintain old versions of relationships. At some point, growth requires honesty, and honesty often creates temporary discomfort. I think that's why this middle season can feel lonely sometimes too, because you're no longer fully connected to the old identity, but not fully grounded in the new one yet. So there's this strange emotional floating feeling like, who even am I right now? And honestly, I think that question is more normal than people realize because identity evolution is real. You are not supposed to stay exactly the same forever. Your needs change, your values change, your awareness changes. And once your awareness changes, you cannot fully go back unconscious again. You start noticing where you're overextending, where you're betraying yourself, where you're performing instead of living authentically. And once you notice those things, it becomes harder and harder to tolerate them. That's growth, not dysfunction, growth. And honestly, I think one of the kindest things women can do for themselves during this phase is stop demanding immediate perfection from themselves. You are allowed to be in process. You are allowed to be becoming. You are allowed to practice. You are allowed to wobble while learning new ways of existing. That doesn't mean you're failing. That means you're evolving. And maybe that's the experiment this week. Not trying to become a completely different person overnight, not trying to have everything figured out immediately, just pausing in moments where your old patterns want to take over and asking yourself, what would the version of me I'm becoming do here? Not the perfect version, not the fearless version, just the slightly more aligned version. And then trying it, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it feels unfamiliar, because identity is not something you think your way into. It's something you practice your way into. And every single time you act in alignment with the version of yourself you're becoming, you make her a little more real.
Thanks for listening to Experiments in Happiness. You can find more tools and resources at experimentsinhappiness.com.